Note, this video is in no way sponsored or endorsed by the Army Painter. I just seem to end up buying a lot of their products. In today's video, we're going to unbox the Speed Paint starter set from the Army Painter. The starter set includes colours such as Zealot Yellow, High Lord Blue and Blood Red, as well as Orc Gridskin Green, Fire Giant Orange and Hive Dweller Purple. In addition to the primary colours and their secondary colour derivatives, the lineup also includes hobby favourites such as Pallid Bone, Hardened Leather, Crusader Skin and Gravelord Grey. Speed paints have a long and storied lineage. Aside from their wacky names, these paints are the latest iteration of a long-running trend in miniature painting hobby. Who remembers GW's foundation paints, the Army Painter dip method, contrast paints, or even the Citadel airbrush? All now forgotten in history's dustbin. All these revolutionary products share the same claim that they can make the miniature painting process either quicker or easier, frequently both. Let's take High Lord Blue for a test drive on this barbed devil and test out that claim. Straight away, I'm struck by the consistency and the surface tension, or lack of it, in the paint. This allows the paint to simply glide over the model. As you can see, the brush barely touches the miniature and the paint is flowing off of it and straight into all those recessed areas, creating simple highlights and effective shades with just one coat of paint. Loading the brush feels more like loading an ink wash than some thicker consistency paints, and the flow of paint onto the model really is incredibly smooth, flowing from the bristles and sinking straight into their recesses. Earlier on, I mentioned Citadel's foundation paints. I thought I'd mention that because they've since been discontinued, although I did find a gushing article on the Games Workshop website claiming that, and I quote, "Foundation paints were some of the first paint ever designed specifically for miniatures painting." Right, okay. And later on, the page claims that paints were a smash hit. Other than going on then to compare the buying of foundation paints to buying your first music album. Mostly, I remember these paints for eating my brushes and they chipped off almost any surface almost immediately. If anyone watching this video does equivocate buying Citadel foundation paints with buying their first ever music album, why not tell us all about it in the comments? Now you'll notice though, the reason I mention this is that I'm using a fairly battered brush in these shots. And that's mostly because when testing out a new product, it's best not to find out that it kills your brushes by using your rosemary sable as a guinea pig. So apologies that this video doesn't feature my finest brushes, but I thought if I'm testing them out, I'm not going to use my best brushes just for a test run. This is an experiment after all. However, so far I've found that unlike even inks or varnishes or the contrast paints, this speed paint doesn't appear to destroy brushes. But I guess I'll need to use more paint to be able to back up that claim. Now I've chosen to paint the Dungeons & Dragons Nolzur's miniatures in this video, and the reason I'm doing that is because one of the requirements for speed paints is that they go onto a white or light grey primer. Although it's not obvious for the High Lord Blue, but it's more obvious with this Orc Skin, which is a green colour. The paint really requires a light primer, and the Nolzur's miniatures come straight out of the packet pre-primed. Orc Skin, which is the green, is just as smooth as the High Lord Blue, and what gives this product such a satisfying feel is the immediacy at which effective highlights and shades are produced. Now for an unboxing. Every video has to have one, and in this case we're popping Alip and Deathclaw Deathlock out of their blister. Two bases, nice. I've chosen these two miniatures for their spectral and translucent plastic. It's really hard to find convincing spectral miniatures, and I want to capture that ethereal or translucent effect with the speed paint. The second miniature, Deathlock, is something universally satisfying about an undead mage. It flips on its head the tropes of kind of a shambling zombie. Now, one of the features about these Nolzur's miniatures is unfortunately the plastic is a little soft and can bend. Now onto the Alip. So I'm going to use Gravelord Grey for this miniature. And the reason I'm using that is that the the miniature I wanted to create a kind of feel like it's made of smoke or some kind of shadow. There's no black or white in the starter set, and I've not checked, but I'm pretty certain that there isn't a black or white colour in the Army Painter speed paint range. There's also no metallics currently, and the reason for that is because of how the paint works. It creates a highlight by using the primer on the lightest, most raised areas, and then settles into recessed areas. So you can see here, as I paint the screaming skull of this Alip, you can see that the paint settles in the eyes and the mouth hole, the recessed areas, but the brow and the eyebrows of the skull, for want of a better word, as well as the fingers and these tendrils of smoke, are left lighter. For that reason, it would be very difficult for them to do a white paint, as it just wouldn't settle properly. Because in a white colour, you'd want to have the whitest areas, not with the most pigment in them, not in the recesses of the model, but on those raised areas. So perhaps you could use a dry brushing method to get white on top of Army Painter speed paints if you wanted to get white in your miniatures. Alternatively, as you're using a white primer or light grey primer, you could just leave those areas in their natural primed plastic. Remember, these are sold as a speed paint. A lot of the Army Painter products are sold with that promise of more time for painting. With this in mind, I'm now going to start looking at the Deathlock. So I used the pallid bone for this figure. Originally I intended to give him a skull, and then paint his trousers and his arms as if he's wearing clothing. But because I wanted to just use this Army Painter speed paints, I was limited to just having the 10 colours. So I in the end chose to give everything this pallid bone colour, and didn't use the Crusader skin on this miniature. The pallid bone is an interesting colour. I was expecting it to be more of a kind of ivory result, but it comes out with almost like a yellow. So it really is for quite aged bones, rather than an ivory or off-white colour. In this case, with this model, I thought it was appropriate that it would be a kind of mummified look, so it has a kind of mummy feel. And these perhaps could be also interpreted as well as the necrotic flesh, but as bandages or as mummy wrappings. So I painted on the pallid bone across all of the model's skin areas, and as well as his legs and arms. Came back and touched up the face for a second coat, noting again that the paint really quickly falls into the recesses. Having limited myself to just using the colours from the starter set, and having already used Orc Skin and the High Lord Blue on the two barbed devils, it was time to try out mixing the colours. I was really keen to see what would happen if you mixed the speed paints, and so I thought the robes would look good, not in a grey, as a kind of black robe, but perhaps see if I could make a sort of ethereal blue, a translucent blue-green, a sea green. And so that's what I did. Now, it does appear that the speed paints do mix, although they don't mix quite the same as conventional paints for some reason. I'm not quite sure of the details around the pigments and things, but you can mix them on the palette quite easily. It doesn't affect their speed paint qualities. Now the challenge for me here is finding enough content for me to fill 3 minutes of discussion. Now, I've never claimed to be a great painting expert or a great source of painting wisdom, and I don't consider myself to be a particularly good miniature painter. However, I do think that there are a few observations I can make about the paint and how they work. First of all, it's to do with this effect of creating instant highlights and shadows, and that's to do with the surface tension of the paints. I would recommend, and I'd use this same advice even if using conventional non-speed paint or non-contrast paints, but it's really important to make sure that when using these colours, you start with the lightest colours and then move into darker tones, rather than starting with the dark tones and moving into light areas over the top. And the reason for that is that the speed paints do have a tendency, because of their very low surface tension, to kind of flow over lines. So if there's a relief area of detail, the paint just kind of flows over it. It doesn't really respect boundaries in the miniature. Now this is good, because it's one of the reasons why the paint is so quick to use, but it's bad because it means that that it does quite quickly flow over areas that have already been painted. Now, I did want to see if I could do some wet blending. Now, wet blending is a technique that requires a lot of skill and patience, and is not normally achieved by slapping on two colours just over the top of each other. However, in this case, I think I've managed to get away with it. Now, I don't find it to be too much of a problem myself in this video, but one of the comments people make around the Army Painter speed paints is that the paint reactivates. And what this means is that once speed paints are applied to an area, it's almost impossible to paint one coat of colour over another, because as soon as you start adding the next coat, it reactivates the coat before. Now that's really good if you want to get a blue-green look, but it would probably be quite frustrating if you're trying to paint stripes or details in clothing. So I wouldn't recommend using this product for that purpose. Now the two barbed devils I painted earlier, they were quite easy to paint because they were a single coat of paint on a single colour. But I found with this figure, things like Deathlock's hood here, the paint had quite a tendency to slide over different layers, and so it takes a while to dry. Now, the final miniature in this video I'm using the blood red for, because I realised I hadn't used it, and it's probably one of the key colours. Now, this is a Dungeons & Dragons themed video, and I'm assured that this Reaper Bones miniature of an eye beast is a legally distinct entity from the Dungeons & Dragons classic miniature, the Beholder. The eye beast that I'm painting here has quite a pitted skin, and it's dotted with smaller eyes and punctuated with tentacles and various details. So I was pleased that the Army Painter instantly sank into these crevices and really kind of highlighted the surface texture. A figure like this could be quite dull if it was just a single red coloured ball, but by going over the scales and details, it shows that the speed paints are best off when used on really highly detailed figures with lots of surface texture. So things like fur or scales, maybe sort of draped robes, they're quite good at that, but they're not perhaps so good on flat panel work, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend using them for that. This footage isn't sped up at all, by the way, and you can see straight away how quickly the paint just flows onto the model. It's a bit like a wash. It just really does just flow off of the brush with almost no effort at all. Ordinarily, if I was using brush strokes this imprecise and this fast, I'd get more of a dry brush effect, and there wouldn't be much paint left in the creviced areas, in the recesses. Now, one thing I did note is that things like the teeth, the inside of the mouth, and the eyes of this eye beast were not well suited to the speed paints. So although I did paint them with the pallid bone, I then went back, repainted them with white, and then tried again with a second layer of the speed paints over a white acrylic paints rather than this grey. It does say that you can use the speed paint over pale grey undercoat, but either this wasn't pale enough, or I would still really recommend using white as a base tone, just so you get that highlighted effect. Now let's have a quick gallery of my painted miniatures that I've made for this video. Whilst we're looking at the gallery, it might be a good time to remind you that engaging with shaky cam YouTube videos isn't always the best way of looking at painted miniatures, and there is still the Olympian Gamers Instagram page where you can see still images of many of the painted works that we've featured in the videos. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe. I'd be really interested in hearing other people's comments on the figures and also on the speed paints themselves. If you've got any top tips, if you share them in the chat, then you can share them with others and we can all learn something. I'm going to also try in the future, I don't know if I'll make a video of it, the speed paints on historical figures. so perhaps something more familiar for our historical miniature audience. If you've come to this video as a D&D fan, I don't personally play much D&D, but I promise there will be some D20 related roleplay content in the channel in the coming months, depending on the release schedule. Also, please don't hesitate to like and comment, as this will encourage me to speed up the production of videos.